Cone of Silence by Jim Lee. Chapter 2. Ellie's mother, Elizabeth, had faded to little more than a shadow in her daughter's mind in the years which had passed since her death. Most of the clear memories which remained were now like thick scar tissue, numb and unresponsive. They seemed like grainy footage from some home movie of someone else's life to her. But there was one which stood inviolate, one which, perhaps, could stand for all the others that had faded. Ellie felt guilty that the others had grown dark and indistinct. She believed it was a form of weakness, of cowardice, that she had indulged in to assuage her own pain. All the more, then, she clung to this shining landmark of the past, and it was as clear in her mind now as if no time at all had passed. It was in March of 2001. Only a mere month later, Elizabeth Keck and her unborn son would leave her husband and daughter. But on that day, she seemed to Ellie the absolute paragon of feminine strength and independence. Ellie had come home from school in tears. She was in second grade. Her 8th birthday was still 2 months away in May. She loved going to school. Her 2 best friends, the boys in the houses next door on either side, weren't in her classes, but there were lots of other kids she liked. She had many friends, and even now, thinking back, she couldn't really think of any of the children who she didn't like. Well, granted, there was that one boy who picked his nose, but he wasn't a mean person, just gross. She tried to be nice to him anyway, because that was how she had been raised. In later years, she had been obliged to revise that philosophy. Sometimes you had to be cruel to be kind. Sometimes, if you didn't tell the gross ones that they were gross, they deluded themselves into thinking you liked them. Liked them. Years later, that booger-picker had run wailing down a hallway away from her. Her kindness over the years had been misinterpreted, perhaps. He had tried to hug her, and when the hug, which she had reluctantly allowed at first, began to change, she had withdrawn violently, recoiling in disgust, and had lashed out with all the cruelty of which she was capable. In truth, that hadn't been very much, but it was enough to make him cry in front of all the other kids. In a single moment, all his efforts to live down the playground epithets of his early boyhood had been shattered. The very next Monday, there was a moment of silence held for him. He had overdosed on his mother's pills. The school had offered grief counseling for students, but she hadn't felt any need to take them up on it. It was a case of too little, too late, as far as she was concerned. The counseling should have come years before, she thought. The truth should always be spoken. She knew that now. Holding back in the name of politeness, trying not to hurt someone's feelings, that didn't help anyone in the long run. There was no need to be excessively vicious. Most boys shriveled up like salted slugs if they were rejected. Usually, as she later learned, they appreciated being let down gently but honestly. If she had known that years ago, Mark might still be alive. But this memory predated all of that. She was a very outgoing student, and she loved all the subjects she was learning. But her teacher in second grade was a different matter entirely. Mrs. Clarkin was an ancient battle-axe of a woman, a relic of a bygone age who scuttled through the halls of the school like an ironclad beetle beneath the tower of a massive silver beehive hairdo. The children all disliked her. Their mutual aversion to her actually created bonds of camaraderie among all her students. She retained all the values of the era which had spawned her hairstyle, though, given that she seemed by all accounts to have nothing good to say about any period in history, does raise the curious question of the rationale for that loyalty. That curiosity notwithstanding, however, she still believed that boys should be doctors, lawyers, firemen, or police, and that girls should be housewives and mothers first and foremost. If a girl found herself obliged to retain employment, though, there were careers which were suitable for women: nurses, retail clerks, secretaries, hairdressers, or for the more adventurous, perhaps stewardesses or teachers. Women should know their place, and it was not to be acting like a man, according to Mrs. Clarkin. However, the school's curriculum, even in the backwater of Ryan, was being compelled to espouse a more modern view. As a result, Mrs. Clarkin's reading class was treated to a viewpoint in the textbook which the teacher herself found repugnant. Being herself a voracious reader, Ellie was not at all sheltered in her thinking. So when the textbook presented a short description of Amelia Earhart, story would have been too generous for the limited vocabulary blurb, and then prompted the students to discuss other famous women, Ellie was bursting to share from her growing store of examples. She told the class about Cleopatra and Marie Curie, and they all listened with rapt attention. She had begun to wax poetic on Joan of Arc, when some fusible link in the teacher's brain, tasked with managing her rage, finally could bear the load no longer and boiled away into vapor. The imposing shadow of the beehive fell over Ellie as the elderly matron marked briskly up to the girl and leveled one desiccated digit in her startled face.
Do you know what all of your feminist heroes have in common, Eleanor?
She demanded, with a singing note of tension in her voice. Ellie shook her head respectfully, a little too nerved by the sudden aggressive movements of the teacher to speak at the moment.
Well, then I'll tell you, shall I? They are all dead. And not just of natural causes. Oh, no. Each and every one of them died doing things they had no business doing because they were trying to act like men. Cleopatra died a horribly painful death brought on by the poison in the bite of the snake she held because she herself bit off more than she could chew, trying to act like a king. Joan of Arc was burned at the stake, like the witch she was, because she had the delusion that she could act like a general. Marie Curie died in agony because her insides were fried out by the radiation produced by the compound she fiddled with, because she thought she had any business trying to be a scientist like her husband. And as for Amelia, well, I can promise you this. She's not out there somewhere living some mysterious secret life like all you foolish little trollops want to tell yourself. She either crashed into the ocean, where her brains were smashed out onto the dashboard of that plane, or else her lungs burst as she drowned. Oh, or maybe she got really lucky and found some tropical island to become marooned on, where she might have actually lived long enough to starve to death. Because women have no business being pioneers, or explorers, scientists, generals, kings, soldiers, or presidents. A woman's job is to tend to the raising of children, to the keeping of the home, to the support of the men of the world. Anything outside of that is unnatural and will always end in tragedy.
The entire classroom was thunderstruck into absolute silence by this deranged diatribe. The only sound which could be heard was the faint tick of the second hand in the large wall clock at the front of the classroom. Ellie's eyes were glaring blue moons of shocked horror, and tears began to well up in them as her lips began to quiver. She had always been taught to respect her elders, and that training was now warring with a righteous indignation at having so many of her treasured icons vandalized in this manner, combined with an overmastering fear of the unknown. Her heart was traveling now into terra incognita, uncharted territory for a young girl who had not yet completed 8 orbits around the local star, facing down a veritable veteran of oppression who had seen perhaps as many as 70 winters come and go. In spite of all that, throughout the rest of her life, she took comfort in the fact that while her response was small, she did make one. In the face of even such opposition as this, she would not acquiesce silently. "You're wrong," Ellie said. She spoke quietly, but not calmly. As she spoke, the dam holding back her conflicting emotions ruptured, and her tears began to gush. Her vision became blurred, and she wiped the fluid away with the back of her hand. She stood up from her desk, and her chair was pushed over to the floor behind her with a resounding clunk. The teacher drew back, but only the slightest bit. She was not accustomed to children showing the fortitude to resist, and was not about to get used to it now. She began to prepare a scalding command to put the girl back in her place, but got no further than painting the twisted expression of disgust on her face that she meant to accompany this barrage before the mouthy little brat shrieked at her.
"You're wrong, you bitter old cow! You're wrong! And just because you've wasted your life in this dead-end town doesn't mean I'm going to!"
Ellie screamed, pointing right back at the teacher. Then she turned and ran out of the room. Every face in the class was frozen in astonishment, teacher and students. The teacher across the hall, Mrs. Landry, had stuck her head out of her door into the hallway and wore the same expression. It seemed the sound of the words had carried in the mostly brick building. Ellie saw none of them. She only ran. She ran out of the school and out of the parking lot. She ran all the way home, some 5 miles from the school. When she arrived home, her mother had been in the yard in front of the house, where she had been turning over sections of the little garden she wanted to grow. Ellie's tears had stopped on the long run home, but now her head was pounding and she was gasping for breath. The nerves in her legs continued to fire, as if they thought she was still running, and they felt like little electric bugs trapped in her pant legs, zapping her every other second. She opened the little gate in the picket fence, which on this day still pivoted silently on its well-oiled hinge, but her mother still heard the sound and turned, straightening. When Elizabeth saw her daughter, flushed and gasping for air, her fingers forgot the shovel. It toppled over and bounced off the turf with a muted, ringing pang. She spread her arms wide and plastered an expression onto her face, which was a mixture of comforting reassurance and concern. She later would tell both child and husband that all manner of nightmarish possibilities swarmed through her head at that moment, and it took an effort not to let that panic show, lest both of them find themselves bawling. Ellie didn't know that at the time, of course. What she saw was the image which was seared into her brain, forever assigned as the placeholder for all memories of, or for any reference to, Elizabeth Keck. What Ellie saw was a proud female warrior, the face framed by the sun directly behind her, shafts of light radiating out from her glistening blonde hair, like some classical artist's rendition of an angelic messenger. Across the flesh of her right cheek, a thin white icicle of scar tissue flared amid the bloom of color there. Her arms were spread wide in a beckoning embrace over the visible mound of the tiny life she carried within her, Ellie's brother. Despite the cool of the March afternoon air, the collar of her mother's shirt was ringed with sweat from the effort she had been putting into her toil in the earth. Most of all, she saw unconditional love on her mother's face. She began to cry all over again, for a reason she could not explain. A month later, of course, she had a perfectly serviceable explanation, but no longer anyone to hear it. She ran to her mother's embrace and cried. When her lament tapered off, she had a clear thought. Though unspoken, it had the clarity of a spoken phrase, one which accompanied this memory of her mother for the rest of her life. She had heard of photographic memory. If there was an auditory equivalent, she would one day think that she might have such a thing. The thought was this: I wish I could stay in this moment forever. She couldn't, of course. We never can, no matter how much we may wish it. No sooner did her tears abate than her mother wanted to know what had caused them, of course. And, of course, she told her. She left out no detail. She felt no guilt, and made no attempt to color the story in such a way as to conceal her role. She had spoken what she believed to be true, when pressed by circumstances to do so. It was only as she watched her mother's expression darken with each word, first of Mrs. Clarkin's harangue, and then her own response to it, that she began to question whether that burgeoning glower might be aimed at herself. "Are you mad at me?" she asked, when she had finished her tale. The immediacy with which that ominous thundercloud in her mother's expression vanished, and the ferocity of the renewed embrace which followed, told her all she needed to know to reassure her that she had done right. Of course, the school called to notify Ellie's parents that she had left school grounds, and ostensibly to inquire after her well-being. Elizabeth agreed to meet with the teacher and the principal. Gerald was told when he got home, and he was no less furious than his wife. When the little group met at the school the following day, however, the teacher was quick to advance her own account of everything which was said. Some things were admitted to be part of the lesson plan, others were claimed to have been taken out of context, and some things were flat out denied entirely. The principal was clearly prepared as a foregone conclusion to accept every statement of Mrs. Clarkin's at face value, while dismissing Ellie's account entirely out of hand. Ellie's parents had no doubt, though, that she was telling the truth. Gerald had impressed upon her from the beginning that the truth was very important. After all, he made his living, at least in those days, by finding it, no matter how hard people tried to hide it away. The truth, he had taught her, wants to be found out, and when all else fails, it will find a way. He had gotten her to believe this by virtue of a simple fact. He himself believed it. The school refused to see any other version but that reported by the teacher. Mrs. Clarkin was graciously willing to overlook Ellie's undermining of her authority in front of the other students, but only because she had always been such a good student until now. Of course, this largesse came with a condition. Ellie must apologize, they said, in front of the rest of the class, to undo the damage she had done to the order and structure of the class. Gerald bristled angrily at this. "Like hell she will," he spat. Elizabeth patted his hand, which she held clasped in hers. She was of two minds in the matter. She was proud and pleased that he refused to let their beautiful girl be cowed before this old witch. Yet, at the same time, she knew all too well that Gerald's temper could blaze from spark to wildfire in a matter of moments. He had never turned the red eye of that rage upon either of them. But she knew things he had preferred not to discuss about his work and about his life before, and of course she had seen it in action. So often she felt like the cool water which must continuously flow through a nuclear reactor to prevent a catastrophic meltdown. She believed that, like a nuclear fire, there was a part of him that wanted to melt down, part of him that relished the abandonment of control to the flames of rage. And it was her role to play, to always be there to quench that fire and be the voice of reason. Sometimes she wished he didn't have such a temper, but then she would remember the robbery and reminded herself that there were times and places in this world when it was good to have a demon in a bottle that you could call upon when you needed it. It had been the year after they got married. There hadn't been a lot of money when they got hitched, and the honeymoon hadn't exactly been lavish. But the year since hadn't been too bad, and Gerald wanted to celebrate their anniversary with a little more style. Why he thought that Vegas qualified in that regard was, in itself, a mystery. But she had agreed, and they had driven the 1,200 miles to Las Vegas. They had taken their time sightseeing and eating at what had to be every weird, greasy spoon in the American Southwest. Elizabeth had difficulty holding down the breakfasts, more and more as their trip went on, but detective or no, Gerald totally missed that clue. The right moment to make the announcement just hadn't come yet. They visited the Grand Canyon, and every time she would start to worry that they were lost, he would make the old Bugs Bunny joke.
I knew I should have made that turn at Albuquerque.
He beat that old horse to death on the long road across Arizona. They got to Las Vegas, and it was everything she thought it would be. Noisy, crowded, crass, and full to bursting with plastic light. She saw the perfect symbol for the place sitting on a bench at a bus stop. A styrofoam coffee cup with lipstick smeared around the rim, with a cigarette butt floating in the murky liquid inside. She said nothing, though. They had arrived at the hotel where they had reserved a suite. The bottom of the building contained a parking garage, and once they found a place to park in the subterranean hive, they began the laborious task of lugging their baggage to the bank of elevators in the middle of the level. Halfway there, Elizabeth remembered she had forgotten her purse. "Not to worry, my sweet," Gerald sang cheerfully when she told him. The baggage was on wheels. "You continue to trundle along, and I'll be back before you reach the elevators," he said, and sprinted away. Elizabeth continued toiling along. The wheels on the little makeshift cart were doing most of the work, and the concrete here was sloping gently downward. The real job here was keeping the whole pile from toppling over and spilling their possessions all over the place. She was focusing all her concentration on this, then, and did not notice the two young men slink from between two nearby cars with oily grace as she passed by. "Excuse me, señorita, but I am afraid we must impose on you. Give us your money, or we will hurt you," the taller man said. It was difficult to see them well in the dim lighting of the garage, but it was clear from their complexion and the accent of the speaker that they were Hispanic, probably Mexican. Even in the dim light, though, she could see that both men were brandishing long knives. She immediately began thinking of all the things she had ever heard in her life about robberies. Just give them what they want. It's only money, she thought, and reached for her purse, before remembering the reason Gerald wasn't here in the first place. I don't have it with me," she explained, gesturing to the place on her side where the purse would normally hang, as though this bandit would see it missing and understand the foolishness of the situation. He did not. "You have this mountain of bags, and you expect me to believe that your cartera is not among them? Do not play games with me, señorita. I am in haste." The hand of the speaker not holding the knife flashed out and seized her painfully by the wrist. The flash from her wrist made her hiss a quick intake of breath, but otherwise she made no sound. A panicked thief, such as could result from a shrieking woman, might lash out in an effort to regain control. The handle of the little luggage cart dropped to the ground, and the cart actually continued with its momentum for a foot or so down the sloping floor until the dragging handle halted it. "I left it in the car. My husband went back to get it," she said quietly. She was still stunned by the surreal nature of the whole thing. The man, he was hardly older than a boy, really, seemed to have gotten his lines from watching old Zorro movies. I mean, really, she thought, who says I am in haste? This thought threatened to summon a chuckle, in spite of the danger, and she quickly squashed it. The quickest way to force this young man to prove himself to be a badass would be to make him think he was being mocked by his victim. She saw Gerald round the line of cars above them and begin to jog toward them. "That's him now," she said softly. Sure enough, he was clutching a large black leather purse in one hand, in the way men do, grasping it by the opening, crunched together in one hand, rather than by the straps, so that any passerby would not mistake him for a fruit. Zorro called out to Gerald, as his accomplice moved forward to block his path. "Senor!" he yelled. The echo bounced around the garage, into the voids above and below. "We have your lady. Give us the money, or I will cut her." As he shouted this, he twisted her wrist, spinning her around so that she faced Gerald, and with Zorro's hot breath in her ear. She felt the hard line of the knife press into the side of her face. Gerald clumped to a halt a few feet before the accomplice. He held both hands above his head, the purse still clutched there. "I don't want any trouble. I'll give you the money, just let her go," he barked. He sounded a little winded, but only a very little. The occasional need to chase someone on foot in his line of work provided all the necessary motivation for Gerald to have included a decent cardio workout in his regimen.
"You are not in any position to give orders, senor,"
Zorro said slyly.
"Perhaps you need some encouragement,"
he went on. Then a white-hot pain flared in Elizabeth's cheek as she felt the knife slice through the tender flesh there. She heard and felt the scraping of the metal across her cheekbone. She screamed. And suddenly, her own scream was drowned out by a tremendous bellow of anger. Painted on Gerald's face was a fury so total that for a moment she forgot her own pain in her shock. She watched as he lunged forward and felt her heart sink as the accomplice drove his blade into Gerald's stomach. But Gerald didn't even slow down. The shorter, fatter assailant looked up into Gerald's face, horrified to see that his attack had utterly failed to stop this howling terror. The purse still held in his left hand, Gerald drove the heel of his right palm into the nose of Bernardo, and he slumped loosely to the ground like a sack of potatoes, and Gerald continued forward. Elizabeth could see the handle of the knife bobbing up and down as he ran toward them. Zorro started to say something, but even with his face right next to hers, she couldn't make it out. Before he could make himself heard, Gerald hurled the purse overhead. It bounced off the roof of one of the cars on the other side of the aisle, where it immediately sprayed its contents in all directions. Lipstick tubes, sunglasses, tampons, now present only by force of habit, chewing gum, coins, keys, eyeliner pencils, and seemingly a million other items she had collected over the years, clattering and ringing and clanging and fluttering in a veritable firework of sound and color. Zorro's eyes were on the prize. His grip, both on her and on the knife, slackened as he watched the contents of the bag cartwheel across the polished top of the big caddy it had hit. He watched in fascination as the little treasure trove of quarters she had brought along to play in the slots danced and spun, making their own unexpected pachinko music as they rattled down the windshield, bounced off the mirrors, tinkled on the concrete. He couldn't help himself. Zorro had never seen such a beautiful symphony of chaos. It was longer than he could afford, however. He tore his gaze away from the waterfall of semi-precious metals, only just in time to see the blurred face of the man who had somehow crossed the distance in the blink of an eye, to see the comet of curled fist which smashed his nose. He felt something behind his nose give way as well. It was like when he and his hermano Luis used to sit in church as kids, each squeezing one wrist with the other, until the hand was cold and pale. Then they would let go, and the blood would rush in to bring life back into their starved manos. This was like that, but different. This wasn't life returning, this was life leaving. The gringo was on top of him now, roaring incoherently. The world seemed caught in molasses. Everything moved slowly. The gringo he had hoped would be as panicked and terrified as the other two he and Luis had robbed had disappeared. In his place now was El Diablo, who his abuela had told him hungered to eat the souls of niños malos. He had caught up to them at last, and the savage blows which continued to pummel his face and pound the back of his head into the cold concrete, releasing more of that warm life flow, would soon peel his soul out of his body, and El Diablo would eat it. He tried to apologize to his abuela. He was sure she was watching and laughing from heaven, but his teeth were all floating around in his mouth. Some of that life tried to flow down his throat and carry a tooth with it. He choked and spluttered. And suddenly, El Diablo was gone. He couldn't see anything. He was floating in the dark. But the weight on top of him moved away, and faintly, like it was coming from some room in the back of the hacienda, he heard a muffled woman's voice saying, It's okay, Gerald. It's okay. I'm okay. It's all right. You stopped them. It's okay. Beyond that, he heard sirens, and then everything went black. The sirens were actually hotel security, who had responded as soon as they had picked up the activity on the omnipresent security cameras. Las Vegas PD arrived shortly thereafter, and ambulances after that. The police had a few questions, especially after seeing the extensive damage done to Zorro, but once hotel security identified Gerald and Elizabeth as guests, they were the picture of cooperation in producing the footage showing that the guests had been attacked first. Normally, even with the excuse of self-defense, the brutality of Gerald's response would likely have had him in jail as well. However, in a town which makes its living off of the tourist trade, the idea of castigating a tourist who had been preyed upon while on their property summoned an attorney for the hotel, who seemed instrumental in making the concerns of the LVPD vanish like so much mirage in the Nevada desert. This man was a hero, they said. He defended himself and his wife against murderous assailants, and if the blood loss and pain he suffered interfered with his judgment and blurred the line of excessive force, who can blame him for that? The fact that Zorro and Bernardo, a.k.a. the brothers Ramon and Luis Gonzalez, had been lurking in the garage repeatedly over the last several days was probably also on the mind of the hotel attorney. The Keck suite was upgraded to a VIP suite and offered to them free as an apology for the terrible experience they had endured. It was hoped, the attorney said, that they wouldn't let this unfortunate, rare misadventure spoil their enjoyment of the jewel of the high desert. The elder brother, Ramon, died of complications arising from his injuries a week later, but not before he had been allowed a visit from his brother Luis. Ramon spoke to his brother in whispers, and Luis sat wide-eyed, with tears streaming down his face. Ramon passed in his sleep that very night. "You must have really knocked the other guy for a loop," the doctor who was examining Gerald said. Elizabeth's wound had been deep, but clean and straight. There would be a scar, but once the wound was closed up, it was not life-threatening. Gerald's wounds, on the other hand, were extensive. The puncture wound had missed any vitals, but running afterward and jumping on Ramon had caused all kinds of ragged secondary damage. His knuckles had been covered with bruises and lacerations, and it was these that the doctor was now examining. "I think I might have killed him," Gerald said softly. "Ugh, could you be any more square?" Elizabeth asked. The police hadn't finished with their questioning yet, and she was terrified that they might be being recorded. "You didn't kill him. You saved our lives. They would have killed us if you hadn't acted." Gerald tried to sit up to look at her. "Are you sure?" he asked. His expression was plaintive. Whatever his feelings at the time had been, he didn't want to be a killer. He just wanted to keep her safe. The doctor pushed him back down onto the bed. "Lay back down. You're going to have to take it easy, or you'll pop those sutures I took all that effort to put in." He produced a penlight and shone it in Gerald's eyes one at a time, sweeping left to right, down to up. "I don't know the origin of these injuries, and I don't think I want to know. What I do know is that you've no cause for such a negative attitude." Sweeping with the penlight in the other eye, left to right, down and up. "You need to look at this from a positive direction. You've had a bad experience, but you've both survived when things could have been much worse. You came here to have a vacation, and from what I hear, you're going to get a red carpet treatment here that will make this vacation one to remember for a lifetime. And," he said with a wink, "the pain medication such injuries allow me to prescribe would make a rock band jealous." "Yeah," Gerald said with a sigh. "We'll remember this forever, all right." Elizabeth made a decision. "Nothing stronger than aspirin for me, I'm afraid," she said. "It wouldn't be good for the baby." "Aw, don't worry about it. You need to..." Gerald said, and then stopped. Did you say the baby? Yes, she said, as she caressed the hand which had already been bandaged. You saved all 3 of us. When Gerald had sufficiently recuperated to be able to move around freely without fear of reopening his wounds, they drove out to the northeast edge of town, where the interstate snakes out of the hills in the direction of Utah. They found a parking spot as high up in the hills as they could find, while still retaining a view of the vast expanse which stretched away to the south and west. They watched the sun set together, a mountain of flame sizzling away into the flat, endless sands of the high desert. And as it did, Gerald told Elizabeth, "This is what I brought us here to see. I was never interested in the gambling or the shows or even the buffets. Years ago, I was driving this highway and came out of the hills to see this view." As they watched, the yellow arc sodium lights of the strip winked to life, one by one. The fainter neon lights, with their garish primary colors, twinkled distantly, surrounded by a sea of sparkling gold. I thought it looked like a vast pirate treasure, with gold coins scattered all across the horizon. And there, he said, pointing at the strip and at the shaft of light which thrust upward out of the Luxor Hotel, at the center lies an embarrassment of jewels. Diamonds, rubies, emeralds, sapphires, spread across the land like the loot of every pirate who ever sailed the seas. All the treasure of Jack's giant from his sky kingdom, just lying there, exposed beneath the cloak of the night. All there for the taking. I thought it was the most beautiful sight I had ever beheld in my life, and I had no one with me to share it. He gingerly clasped her hands. His bandages hadn't come off yet, but he complained they were getting itchy. Soon his hands would be healed, but for now they were still tender, almost as tender as his heart for her. Until I met you. Then I wasn't so sure. I wanted to come back and share this view with you and see which was more beautiful. And now that I have this, she asked, pointing to the slim white line which ran vertically across her cheek. Her bandage had come off yesterday. He turned away from the view and grasped her shoulders. You, he said, punctuating each word with a kiss. Left cheek, right cheek, very gently, chin and forehead. Good answer, she said, and kissed him back. With the oppressive heat of the sun gone, they put the top of the convertible down and held each other as the treasure of diamonds rolled by above, beneath the dome of stars. They were not disturbed. So Elizabeth soothed Gerald now, even as she had long ago. But they stood their ground. There would be no public apology. It was one thing to be beaten by the devil, another thing entirely to kiss his butt and call it ice cream. In the end, it was Ellie herself who proposed a solution. If you require an apology, then I will give you one, she spoke up. But only here. I will not be a spectacle for your amusement. No, Ellie, you don't have to do... Gerald began, but Elizabeth continued to soothe, and he relented, at least to hear what she had to say. Are we agreed? She demanded impatiently. The principal looked back and forth between the child and the teacher. There seemed to be a titanic battle of wills going on here, and he just wanted it to be over. He was not bred for contention, he thought, and visualized the snifter of brandy which awaited him at home at the end of the day. It was a vision he often conjured to help him weather the petty storms of elementary school administrative life. He looked pleadingly at the teacher, who seemed more susceptible to his wheedling. Fine, Mrs. Clarkin snapped. Proceed. I am sorry, Mrs. Clarkin, Ellie droned monotonously. Let me be very precise. I said you were wrong. I do not apologize for that. I will amend it by saying, in my opinion. Since the subject was one of values and the worthiness of career choices, all viewpoints must be considered opinion. In my opinion, you were and are wrong. In your opinion, I am wrong. We must agree to disagree. I called you bitter. It seems to me that you are, but it is impolite to say so, despite your provocation of verbally assaulting every female figure from history which I upheld as worthy of respect. Therefore, I am sorry I called you bitter. I called you old. I do not apologize for that, as it is an accurate description of your body. To require me to apologize for that would be to affirm that it is not desirable to be old, which would be discriminatory. It should not matter whether one is young or old, and no insult can be reasonably taken from an accurate identification unless one admits to harboring discriminatory feelings based on a person's age. I called you a cow. This is the most egregious of my errors. You are clearly not a cow, not in a factual nor in an allegorical sense. A cow is livestock, which can be left relatively unattended in a field eating grass. It will provide milk and meat and require nothing in return but the freedom to graze. You are a human, which is biologically distinct from a cow. If I were to select an allegorical non-human designation for you, I might more accurately choose, say, a snake. I cannot be more precise, for though you seem to enjoy squeezing the life out of young minds with your restrictive and antiquated point of view, like a python, you also seem to enjoy filling those minds with debilitating poison, like a cobra. Either way, the only useful product which can now be gleaned from such a snake is perhaps a type of anti-venom, an ability to survive other snakes and other attacks. I gratefully thank you for your product, and I am sorry I called you a cow. I intimated that you wasted your life in this town. That is clearly not true, for I have learned a great deal from you, even if I only count today. Therefore, I am sorry I said you've wasted your life in this town. I called this a dead-end town, but as that does not reflect on any of its residents directly, I see no need for apology there. I think you will agree that it has been in the best interest of all concerned that my apology was private. If you now insist, however, I will repeat it for the class.
That was no apology. How dare you speak to me that way, you little...
Mrs. Clarkin began, and then trailed off under the imperious glare of the principal. I think we're done here, Mrs. Clarkin. While adults may often disagree on matters of opinion and philosophy, Ellie Mae has expressed herself in an adult, reasonable way, and we want our students to be reasonable adults, don't we? Asked the principal. Mrs. Clarkin glowered, bristling with hate, but said nothing. Gerald managed, barely, to contain his praise until they got in the car, whereupon he burst as if he was about to explode. He laughed all the way home. That night, he stopped by her room. He had a present for her. That was incredible, Ellie. I wish I could have recorded it so I could listen to it over and over again. So I got you this, he said, producing a microcassette recorder from his pocket. We missed this one, but if you ever let a zinger storm like that fly ever again, you have to record it. I was so proud of you, he said, as the laughter began to try to take hold once more. Also, after what we saw today, I think it might not be a bad idea to have an unimpeachable record of any future conversations with your dear teacher. We use them in detective work to gather testimony, particularly from people who don't know they're giving it. I know you've got your sights set a bit higher than being a two-bit mug like me, but those TV scientists are always making audio notes on them too, so you should get used to doing it now. It'll be good practice. I love your two-bit mug, Daddy, Ellie said, and hugged her father. A month later, Elizabeth was dead, and joy and love and many other good things seemed to get lost or misplaced for a very long time in the Keck household. One last thing. After her mother died, Ellie stayed home from school for a week. Her father did not pressure her to return, but Ellie felt she would have to do it sooner or later, and seemed to view the return as a Band-Aid which needed to be torn off quickly, rather than fiddling about with it. The day went normally. All her friends, those who didn't live close enough by to have seen her in her absence, were very sympathetic and very kind. The bell rang, indicating the end of the day. Mrs. Clarkin said sweetly, "Oh, Eleanor, if you wouldn't mind, I'd like to see you for a moment after class." The other children filed out, and Ellie gathered up her things and waited patiently. When the classroom was empty, the teacher stood in front of Ellie's desk. "What have we learned, Eleanor?" she asked smugly. "It's my first day back, ma'am. I've just been trying to catch up," Ellie responded innocently.
Don't give me that. You showed everybody how smart you think you are in the principal's office. What I want to know is what you've learned about how smart you really are," Mrs. Clarkin hissed. In truth, she now actually sounded like a snake. "I don't understand what you mean," Ellie said. Her face was blank and placid. "I told you that it was unnatural for women not to know their place. I told you that it will always end in tragedy," she hissed. At this, she lowered her voice even further. "And now your mother is dead. Dead! Not so smart now, are you?" the crone went on, all but cackling with glee.
Ellie was unmoved by the assault. "I don't understand what you want," she said dully. "Do you want me to cry? Is that it?" The teacher hissed so loudly Ellie thought she might rupture something.
Yes! Yes, you smart-ass little bitch! I want you to cry and admit that you were wrong!"
Ellie stood up from her desk. "No," she said calmly.
"What? What do you mean, no?"
Mrs. Clarkin screamed, forgetting all about trying not to be overheard. "You've already taught me the only lesson you have to teach. Snakes like you can't hurt me anymore. Goodbye, Mrs. Clarkin." The teacher's screams followed her out the door. After making a copy for her father's enjoyment, as requested, she presented both copies of the microcassette to him. Phone calls were made to the principal, to the superintendent, and to Mrs. Clarkin. Harsh words were played and replayed, repeatedly, in undeniable fidelity. The following morning, the principal presided over Ellie's class. He was only filling in as a substitute teacher, he explained. Mrs. Clarkin had suddenly and unexpectedly elected to retire, and until a suitable replacement teacher could be found, he would be filling that position, in addition to his regular duties. He asked the class to pitch in and help him as much as they could, since he hadn't been a teacher for many years, and the class agreed enthusiastically.